Welcome, everyone. I'm here today with Mr. Max Silverman, who is the Executive Director of the University of Washington Center for Educational Leadership. We're excited to speak with him today, as not only has he served in a variety of leadership positions himself, including that of a classroom teacher, a school principal, and a district leader, but he also partners very closely with individual school districts to improve leadership performance at scale. So there's obviously a general agreement that school leaders need to spend most of their time in classrooms. And we'll be speaking with Max today because him and his team spent a lot of time working out how school leaders can spend this time effectively, and specifically how they can do so using a technique called walkthroughs. So we're excited to speak to you, Max, today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I thought we could get started by first hearing from you about the role of a principal in driving instructional improvement in the building. What do you see as the role of a school principal in driving instructional improvement in the school building?
That's a great place to start before we even talk about walkthroughs. I think, there's a few roles that are really critical for a principal or school leader to play around this question of driving instructional improvement. And I think it really starts with the need to create and then maintain a vision for learning and teaching. And it's really remarkable how often you can be in a school and people are walking around doing walkthroughs in our classrooms, but aren't able to connect that to the purpose of what's happening in the classroom. So starting with questions like, what do we want learning to look like? And then what's the teaching that will support that type of learning? Ideally, that's done with staff and students, depending on the context. But first thing being that vision creator and vision keeper for teaching and learning. I think secondly, and I think the research bears this out pretty well now, the leader, school leader, principal, plays a critical role in creating a culture in which teachers work to improve their practice. And in schools where leaders see this as a primary part of their role towards instructional improvement, and realizing the teachers actually are the ones that improve the instruction. So helping them create the culture in which they do that work. And we borrow a lot from the research on cultures of collective efficacy. So creating cultures where teachers see themselves as problem solvers, where teachers see themselves as collaborators, and teachers see themselves as having their own agency in getting better, their own desire to get better. If a leader can get that culture in place next to a powerful vision of teaching and learning, you're moving pretty well then. And then the third thing I would say is it is important for the school leader and principal really to be either the keeper or one of the keepers that constantly uses quantitative and qualitative data to understand the state of teaching and learning. And so, and we really emphasize the quantitative and qualitative data, and that they're doing this consistently, persistently, looking at and thinking about who's learning, why are they learning, and again, using data as a key driver for that. And I don't think you can overemphasize the value of qualitative data, and we'll talk about that, I bet, in a bit when we talk about walkthroughs.
And how do you see walkthroughs specifically helping principals in accomplishing some of these goals that you just spoke about?
Yeah, I guess I would start with you really can't improve instruction or help improve instruction unless you know what's going on in classrooms. So just looking at quantitative data sets doesn't tell you what's causing the data. I think about if we were to give a doctor data on 20 patients and just their height and weight and blood pressure and ask the doctor to then come up with a diagnosis and prescription for how to do it without knowing anything about their lifestyle, about previous conditions. And we often ask principals to do that. Here's your standardized test data, and now make a plan. So the first thing is you got to be where the action is. So walkthroughs serve that purpose, right? It gets people into classrooms. Uh, and it's only then when you're in the classroom can you develop those cause and effect relationships between what the teacher's doing and the learning that's causing or not causing, and for which students. Walkthroughs also play a critical role in, I mentioned earlier, that culture of in which teachers work to improve their practice. And walkthroughs really create a culture of public practice. And in most fields where people are eager to get better, whether that's sports, the arts, business, there's some aspect of practicing in public. And so walkthroughs help create that culture. They norm this idea that it's okay to be in each other's work. And I would add, ideally, walkthroughs happen with leaders and teachers side by side or teachers together, that it becomes a way of working. Uh, and again, not again, but the third part of this for me, I think, is uh, for leaders, it does create relationships, oftentimes one-on-one with teachers or groups of teachers. Again, that's based on improving practice. So because of walkthroughs, feedback seems, not seems, but feedback is more acceptable. I was there, here's what I saw, here's what I'm thinking, does this make sense to you? And the teacher feels a sense of respect, I think, from somebody investing their time in observing, teaching, and learning. It's also through walkthroughs where principals get the data they need to plan professional learning. So it's a really robust structure. And if you have disciplined ways of doing it, you're just collecting all of this qualitative data that you then can connect to the quantitative data and make sense of and think about as a leader, what are your next steps and actions?
I love that example you used with the doctor. Makes so much sense. Max, how do you think about these walkthroughs in places where the teams, either they're small or the school leaders are just beginning to build up their team?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I guess the good news is, and we've spoken before about this, our research shows that even experienced leaders aren't very good yet at observing instruction. So I think even novices should feel comfortable that they're not really behind. I, I think the biggest thing for beginners or novices is just to start with a curious mind and to really just go in and start with some simple questions like, oh, which students are engaged or not? Who seems to be learning or not? What relationship do I see between students? What relationships do I see between teacher and students? And then just what am I curious about? I was just in this room and what am I scratching my head about? And just start like that, because I think if the best thing a novice can do is learn to generate questions from being in classrooms and not feel the pressure of having to come to conclusions, or not feel the pressure of being an expert and saying something to a teacher like, oh, I have to figure out what's going on and give feedback to a teacher. If you're a novice, you can't do that. So I think the best thing they can do is give themselves permission, again, to be curious and to learn how to generate questions and maybe even some early hypotheses around what's going on. And I think with a curious mind, that will fuel deeper and deeper levels of analysis and understanding over time.
All right, that's helpful. And in your research, it'd be lovely to hear more about what you and your team have learned about conducting effective walkthroughs.
Yeah. So it's been a fun journey for me. I've been trying to figure this out for 11 years. And I think the first thing that makes for an effective walkthrough is having an understanding and agreement of why do a walkthrough and what is a leader or a group that's doing the walkthroughs seeking to understand. And we argue that doing a walkthrough to give feedback to teachers is probably different than a walkthrough to plan professional learning. And it's different than a walkthrough to see if you're implementing curriculum. And it's really important that you go in again with that agreement of what you're trying to get done. So I think that's effective step number one, is understanding the reason why spend time in a classroom today. The other thing that we've learned is leaders are more effective when they have a systematic way of thinking in classrooms. And we talk about the habits of thinking for instructional leadership. So walkthroughs are more effective when leaders are able to take collect objective data and just gather evidence, absent of any bias or prejudice. So just the facts. That's really important. And to do that, to be effective, we've learned leaders need to learn how to see, because we typically walk right in with our own bias. And we think pretty quickly like, oh, we take a deficit approach. Why isn't the teacher doing this? Or we might see something we like, oh, the teacher is doing this, this is a great lesson, and miss all those other things to notice. So we want leaders to do things like script. What questions are being asked? What responses does that elicit? Which students are responding? What is the task in front of a student without any bias? Literally, what are students being asked to do? How does that map to the standards that students should be working at that grade level? So that's the first step for us of effective walkthrough, is just being able to gather data. Again, I hate to overdo the medical analogy, but we all want to go to doctors that just want the facts without thinking like, oh, this guy looks lazy, or he or she is overweight, or making some conclusions without the facts. The second part of it for us, again, is this ability to be curious and to really use that data to force the leader to think about what's really going on here. What's the teacher know or doesn't know? What do I know about these students that might be causing learning or not? The other part for us of effective walkthroughs is an ability to take the data and to make low inference claims. So to then begin thinking of, now that I've seen a classroom or 2 or 3 or 4 classrooms, what claims can I make today? Can I claim that things like, it seems like teachers do more of the thinking than the students? Do I have does the evidence dictate that? Are there some claims maybe around which students are engaged or not? And then from there, what makes the walkthrough effective, once you can do some analysis, is what theories do I have that explain this condition? Because it's those theories that drive your thinking on your next steps as a leader. And so often the walkthroughs that we avoid, to be honest, are the ones where people are in a classroom for 10 minutes and then they huddle outside the classroom for 2 or 3 minutes, and immediately everybody gives their opinion. I think that was great. Oh, the teacher wasn't using enough technology. Oh, the 2 students that I observed weren't doing anything. And then they, within 3 minutes, have feedback for the teacher. Here's your next steps. So we think that sort of gather your data and evidence, be curious, develop some claims, try and figure out why you think that's happening, and then be really thoughtful around what, if anything, am I going to share with the teacher? And most importantly for us is, what are my next leadership actions? So based on what I am seeing, what can I do to cause a change in instruction in this classroom or these classrooms? And again, that's typically going to come back to, how am I leading teacher professional learning? How am I making sure my teachers are getting the learning they need? And or what feedback can I give to this teacher or teachers to help them take a next step? And not to be too long-winded here, the other things I would add is using a framework, having a picture of teaching and learning that you can keep referencing back to really helps. So it's not just what's in one person's head or a group's head, makes a big difference. Taking a strength-based approach, seeing what is there as opposed to just seeing deficits, really helps move adults forward in their practice. The other thing I would add is the more that leaders and people on walkthroughs value the calibration they're doing. So taking the time to have the conversation and pushing each other for evidence. So when I walk out of a room and say, boy, those students were really engaged, I need a colleague to say, what's your evidence of that? And I might say, wow, 8 kids, they had their heads down and they were really working. And then I need somebody to say, well, what was the task? Was it worthy of their engagement? And that time that leaders spend calibrating really is what happens in a school or across a school system to begin developing that common language and vision for instruction. You begin building your institutional memory around what good teaching and learning looks like in our school or school system. And these are all things that get shortcut in that drive to let's quickly give our opinions and quickly figure out a next step for this teacher. I know that was a lot, so feel free to ask me some follow-ups or to push for
Yeah.
some more
No,
clarity.
I think just my last question for you would be, so what would be your, and I think that you've already listed a lot of things, but just
Yeah.
for somebody who's maybe just starting out and just thinking about either either a coach pushing their leaders to start thinking about walkthroughs, from your one piece of top advice, if somebody's just starting out to do walkthroughs, what should they keep in mind?
Oh, yeah, that's great. I would say begin with the goal of calibrating. And so pick one thing that you're interested in calibrating around. People often pick student engagement, but they could pick standards-driven instruction. They could pick, teacher moves. There's different things they can pick, but start by picking one thing, go into 3 classrooms together, and try to make sense of that one thing. And get in the habit. I'm amazed at how often leaders will just stand in a classroom with their arms folded and then pretend like they can actually talk about what they saw. So pick one thing, learn how to take notes about it. I'm amazed at how much training we have to do on teaching leaders how to ask students questions that will help them understand what students are learning, which is, everybody likes to ask, what are you learning? Is this interesting and things like that, but that doesn't really give you the data you need. And then just, if you can start quickly building that metacognition and the principles around what have been my actions that has helped this teacher or not to teach in this way, and what might my next actions be. But calibrating, take your time, get in there together with a lens, a focused lens, one thing you want to look for, and try to make sense of it together.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm so glad we could get you here today, Max, to talk to us about this. Thank you so much. That was very useful and very informative. Thanks again for joining us today to talk about this.
Thank you, Aniket. It was a pleasure talking to you.